Welcome to the Charles Perkins Centre Annual Lecture, which we're hosting with the Sydney Law School, and it's fabulous to have Simon, the Dean of Law, with us this evening. This is the first annual lecture we've had for a few years, and that was occasioned by COVID, of course, a break. The tradition has always been that the standard of our speakers is typically up around the Nobel laureate level, literally, and this evening, given it's a very different discipline, we're exactly in that same stratosphere. It's an enormous privilege for me to introduce our speaker this evening, but firstly, as always, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which the Charles Perkins Centre is built, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, elders past, present and emerging, and I welcome all First Nations peoples who are with us this evening. We're named the Charles Perkins Centre after a visionary Aboriginal leader, Charles Perkins, the first man to get a degree from a university in Australia. He was a man who challenged prevailing views of thinking, ways of thinking. He worked across sectors, he had impact in society in a complex issue, and for that reason he's in many ways not only our namesake but our role model. But with that, it gives me huge pleasure to introduce Sheila Jasanoff. Sheila's the Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at Harvard Kennedy School, and she's quite literally a pioneer in the social sciences. She explores the role of science and technology in the law, politics, and the policy of modern democracies, and has written many articles and books. The books include The Fifth Branch, Science at the Bar, Designs on Nature, The Ethics of Invention, and Can Science Make Sense of Life? She founded and directs the STS program at Harvard, where she also forms the Science and Democracy Network, and she previously was the founding chair of STS department at Cornell. In 2022, she received the Government of Norway's Holberg Prize, and that's pretty much the Nobel Prize in the fields of law, humanities, and social sciences. Her other honours include the SSRC's Hirschman Prize, the Humboldt Foundation's Reimar Lust Award, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. She's held distinguished visiting professorships at leading universities in Europe, Asia, Australia, and the US. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society. She's a foreign member of the British Academy and the Royal Danish Academy, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She's served on the AAAS Board of Directors and is president of the Society for Social Studies of Science. She holds AB, JD, and PhD degrees from Harvard and honorary doctorates from the universities of Twente and Liège. So we are in distinguished company. Sheila, please might I invite you to the stage, after which we'll hold a discussion, a panel discussion with two other very distinguished colleagues, and I'll introduce them after Sheila has spoken. So let's welcome Professor Jasanoff.
So thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Warwick and Jean in particular, for being personal hosts for this occasion, and all of my friends in the audience who are here, and of course to the different parts of the University of Sydney that have brought me here, as well as the sort of collaborative network of other scholars in Sydney. I mean, I almost feel I know more people closely in this city than I do back home. So it's very definitely coming to familiar territory in some sense, but familiar territory inflected always in different ways. And it's, as I heard more about Charles Perkins, it was the honor of offering an annual lecture that stands for a life like his became more and more apparent to me. And then I was thinking, well, what dimension of it do I actually want to highlight? One of them, the activism on behalf of Indigenous people in Australia has obviously been spoken of, and it's not something that I personally can do justice to in the same way that people who live here can. But I was taken, as I was thinking about the topic of today's lecture, with a throwaway quotation that I saw attributed to him by somebody else who said that Perkins spanned the distance between Chandelier and Shantytown. And to some extent, in my own sort of recent encounters with questions of inequality, even at this very elite university that I myself teach in, I've become aware of the chandelier as standing for one extreme of that elitism. I had a student a number of years ago who came from a very modest family in the Boston area, and students get to invite faculty members for dinner at their colleges, and so I had gone to dinner at a college that, when I was an undergraduate, was completely associated with classical learning, white maleness, and a particular kind of clubbiness that was Harvard back in those days in the 1960s. But this young man said to me that it had been a challenge for him to get used to Harvard. And I said, like what? And he said, Sheila, you have to understand, I had never seen a chandelier before. So when I saw this quotation about Charles Perkins, it made sense to me as a marker of the kinds of divisions that are still around for people who, he died prematurely in a sense, but we might have been roughly age mates in a sense, or at least not that far apart. So this is a trajectory that I myself have traversed, that I have something to do with, and that I can identify with. And then the purposes of this center, the interdisciplinarity, the focus on marginalized groups and marginalized problems and bringing them to the surface and dealing with them in particular ways, that all felt to me right and proper and as something I could address. But through my own work that I've done collaboratively, and also through the theoretical constructs and ideas that I've been working on developing with my colleagues over the last couple of decades. So I want to pay my own respects to collaboration in a sense. The first part of what I want to talk about today, under the heading of public health sovereignty, flows out of this CompCore project that I've been involved with in particular Stephen Hillgartner of Cornell University. But it is a project that began with COVID. We were all stuck, as you know, in our own homes. Australians were perhaps stuck even more drastically than some other people, but we all were pretty much in place. And therefore, in a sense, it was much easier to gather one's colleagues than it would have been normally. Not in person, but at least when you set up Zoom meetings, people couldn't be anywhere else. They were at home. So it was actually possible to pull together a 16-country study, which would have been almost impossible under any other circumstances, to get first-rate people to be reflecting on what they were going through. And we were very fortunate with funding from our US National Science Foundation, but also with a private foundation, Schmidt Futures, to gather together almost 60 researchers from different places. And so this set of understandings, the ability to do kind of in situ, in the development, big data in a sense, living big data, just would not have been possible under other kinds of circumstances. And I want to pay my homage to all of the people who took time out during this otherwise rather traumatic period and participated in this project. So what were we studying in the project? So everybody was aware that there was a crisis, that it was unprecedented. I have come to think of it as the largest unconsented biomedical experiment that the world has ever participated in. So for all that we talk about informed consent, there was very little information and certainly no consent. And yet it was a biological experiment whose results we're still parsing. What happened, for instance, to mental health? What happens when you take kids out of school and suddenly make it the business of the parents to educate them? And what happens with socioeconomic conditions? You know, I heard of people in San Francisco around Silicon Valley banding together and creating de facto little private schools, but they had the money to do that. What happened to working parents, especially those in essential services, who were not in fact at home tending to their children's education, and yet the schools were shut? And you know, there were innovations such as keeping the schools open for the purpose of serving school lunches, which was something that people didn't think about on day one of the lockdown when they shut down the public school systems. So, you know, there was all this kind of thing brewing in the background that made one think about the crisis as having multiple components. It was not just about public health. It was at least as much about economics. And of course, it was about politics, because how you resolved, how you approached those contradictions between, say, Chandelier and Shantytown, or the equivalents in other societies, that was something that was for politics to figure out. And it was absolutely something that needed to be studied hand in glove with what one was doing with the virus itself. So out of the first 10 months or so of this massive comparative study, we did come up with some empirical binning. And I think that if you're doing theoretically informed work, that it's deeply empirical, you have to start with some kinds of classifications of what are the patterns you're seeing, and then somehow bring them into correspondence or conversation with the theoretical ideas. So instead of moving from theory into empiricism, as talks sometimes do, this talk is going to move from empiricism out towards theory in some sense. And I think actually that's the way science often happens and not the other way around. So we did this binning, and roughly of our 16 countries, a third fell into a domain that we called control countries, and a third into what we called consensus countries, and a third into what we called chaos countries. Not surprisingly, the chaos countries were very hard to typologize, whereas the consensus countries tended to be broadly social democracies and in Northern Europe. And the control countries, although it wasn't geographically determinist in some sense, tended to be Southeast Asia, include Ireland, so Taiwan, Singapore, Australia were part of that module. China, above all, was one of the paradigmatic control countries. So this table summarizes a little bit what was happening, or what was characteristic in the three sectors in this initial binning of how the countries were patterning. I came up with the term public health sovereignty because it became clear that one of the axes of differentiation was a question of just how sovereign are the public health experts in handling what is going on. And by sovereign, I mean that their decisions are not challenged. So our Taiwanese friends and collaborators told us an interesting story right at the beginning about how news of the Wuhan virus had appeared, I think on something like New Year's Eve. Somebody from the Taiwanese CDC was up late listening to the radio and heard that there was this strange virus making waves in Wuhan, and that a plane was about to land from Wuhan. And that person immediately called up their colleagues in the Taiwanese CDC, and a crackdown was imposed almost overnight. Now, contrast this with the fact that many months later, when the French were thinking about why their containment operations hadn't worked, they took the health minister to task in a legislative hearing. And it turned out that France had somehow neglected to notice that there were direct flights from Wuhan to France. So, you have to stop in this sort of very thick description of things going on and ask, how is it that a country like France does not know what the connections are to other places in the world? And around that time, also the New York Times published a very interesting graphic. I mean, I hope that with big data and so on, somebody will start doing studies of just the graphic ways in which people were communicating information, but it showed how quickly the flights left Wuhan and went to all other parts of the world. And, people started wondering, well, why Bergamo? Why northern Italy? And what is the percentage of Chinese workers that are living there? I mean, so there was a whole sort of demographic globalization, what places tie up with what, but also the knowledge. I mean, and also the fact that a single Taiwanese official, at least if this story, which was told to us firsthand by our Taiwanese friends, is to be believed, then it took very little to marshal the entire credibility of the public health system behind a set of moves that cordoned off Taiwan very quickly and kept it insulated. And Taiwan happened to end up with one of the lowest, really extraordinarily low levels of COVID infection throughout the study as we have conducted it. But, I don't know exactly where France stacks up on the Global Health Preparedness Index. I know that the US was number 1 and also number 1 in deaths in developed countries. So, the preparedness index had very little to do with the statistics of what happened with COVID infections. So, there are those kinds of paradoxes that one needed to get into. And for the first 6 months or so, we were just gathering that information and trying to make sense of these patterns and how to think about them. So public health sovereignty, the degree to which public health is seen as a sovereign domain in and of itself, and its orders are taken and believed and left uncontested, that was a major variable across the 16 countries we were looking at. And that, in a way, provides the substrate for the topic of my talk, which says, on the one hand, public health sovereignty, but on the other hand, public reason. Public reason being the domain of explaining, democratizing, getting people on board, sovereignty being the domain of exercise of force, exercise of power, exercise of sometimes unexplained kinds of mandates. So this was the initial set of responses that came out of roughly the first year of the research. But then moving onward, we were led to start thinking about, well, what does it mean to have this public health sovereignty as an idea at all, and how has it come about? Public health happens to be historically one of those areas where delegation of power is now several hundred years old. If you think about the very idea of a quarantine, if you think about how it is that ships, for instance, were kept from landing if there was evidence that there was sickness on board, that these kinds of systems were in place or have been in place for hundreds of years. We know a lot about the epidemiology of Spanish flu at the end of World War I and what was happening at that time. And if you look at the pictures there on this slide, you see a World War I, post-World War I flu clinic set up, and very much the same sorts of things were happening on the right-hand side. So this picture on the right happens to be from Madrid, where field hospitals were set up, but many countries had this kind of thing. New York State, for instance, took over one of our big convention centers and set it up as a clinic. And one of the sort of backbiting and blaming discourses that has emerged in the post-COVID era is about overreaction. Did people estimate these things wrong? And should they have spent so much time in responding to a crisis that was not actually upon us? And as those of you in this audience who have studied risk know, this is one of the big political cleavages of our time. Should you respond after the harm becomes visible, or should you take precautionary action? Now, arguably, Taiwan took precautionary action very quickly, as did China, and there were certain kinds of very marked consequences in terms of the prevalence of the disease. The US prefers to take the risk and act after the risk manifests itself, and the US did so to some extent in this case as well, and ended up with very high levels of mortality. But the discussion has not died down. Just the other day, within the last 2 weeks, I saw an article reanalyzing data to see whether Governor Ron DeSantis, who still is the sort of number 2 candidate for the Republican nomination for the next presidential election, are his claims that he regulated just right, that he did the Goldilocks kind of thing, and therefore kept his state open and not suffering bad economic consequences, but also not suffering bad health consequences. Is that a correct claim? Or if you reanalyze the data, do you find that it's much more stratified and that there were particular periods in which there were excess deaths? So my point is not to try to resolve those debates, but to say that the ideological divide between precaution and act after the fact, or act only when the situation has already manifested itself, that is a very live ideological divide. In America, it accounts for some of the political polarization, and it's going to number crunch COVID for generations to come in support of these kinds of political arguments. So we found as well that countries were adopting 2 broadly different modes of intervention. So it's not enough that it was sovereignty being exercised in one way or another, but sovereignty against what? Was it against the virus, or was it against citizens? What was the unruly thing? Was it the virus that was escaping, or was it that people were misbehaving? And of course, it was both and, but nevertheless, as a strategic matter, some countries preferred to see the virus as the primary focus, and other countries took citizens and their social practices as the more important place to tamp down. So what kinds of controls you imposed depended in part on the initial framing of what it is you were trying to fight. And it is said of the Western European countries, for instance, that the disease came upon them too late, that it was already too late to target the virus. So for instance, German young people went on holidays, skiing holidays, in January and February to Italian Alps and places like that, where the infection was already endemic in some sense, and they brought it back. And this was before enough was known about the transmission rates, and so there were COVID hotspots and so on and so forth. So, to some extent, there was possibly not a choice about how the crisis broke in on people and their ability to react. Nevertheless, to some extent, countries and their public health experts maintained different degrees of attentiveness to what it is they were trying to regulate and control. And that, I think, ends up relating to some extent to how people perceive their democracies. Are threats coming from the outside, or are threats coming from inside? Is it the people who are the rogues, or the ones who don't listen to sovereignty, or is it that there are risks against which you can erect barriers, and then people can behave perfectly fine because they're not being subjected to the invaders from abroad? So by the sort of second year of thinking about these comparative problems, it became clear to at least those of us who were running the project that we really needed to theorize the politics in order to understand these broad binnings and shapings of the empirical world as we were seeing it. And that brought us closer and closer to questions of democratic theory and to questions of legal theory as well. So, of course, we have thousands of years around the world of thinking, well, what is good government? And in particular, what is good government that brings the people in? And so the demos is involved, and there's a central question that this begins with, which is that in very many aspects of our lives, we have a small number of people making decisions for a big number of people, and how is that question to be resolved so that the few have the legitimacy to speak for and act for the many. Now, somehow neglected in that set of conversations is a question that is far more important to modernity, which is the question of knowledge. Why should the few be empowered to know for the many? Now, public health sovereignty, in essence, depends on that. We trust the public health system because it's chock-a-block with experts who know better than us. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard my colleagues at the Kennedy School, who are mostly economists or other public policy experts, talk about how, well, we have to do what the science tells us. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard science telling you anything, but in any case, the phrase that we must do what the science tells us is kind of locked into people's heads. I don't know where, I mean, you know where you get fluoride in the water, but I don't know where you get that sentence. I mean, I only got it as an STS scholar trying to listen to what the world says, but the world had already learned this sentence very well and were parroting it all over the place. So those of you who are interested in early childhood education might, listen carefully to hear where that sentence suddenly gets embedded into people's self-understanding. To the extent it is a sentence, it has a democratic theory set of questions attached to it. Why do we trust the few to know for the many? And of course, there are many answers to this, but I want to elaborate this in the context of COVID crisis and the gap between public health sovereignty on the one hand and public reason on the other hand. So if you take seriously on board that we are talking about at least two parallel delegations in much of the modern world, a delegation that we make through the voting booth by electing people and making them responsible for us, and another delegation that has been much less talked about, where we hand over control to experts, but we haven't theorized that territory very well. We don't know mostly under what conditions and for what purposes and with what constraints we are delegating that authority to experts. Who is an expert? In the first wicked days of the COVID lockdowns, I amused myself by looking for the word expert in the papers that I read on a daily basis, and they were just popping up all over the place. I mean, so for instance, there was an article, I think in the Washington Post at one stage, about expertise about what to do about intercultural relationships during lockdown. You might think, well, who is an expert on cross-cultural relations between people during lockdown? Maybe someone like Neil Ferguson, who was caught going to his girlfriend's house when he shouldn't have been doing it, should have been seen as an expert in that rather than in epidemiology. But in any case, these expertises kept popping up all the time. When cruise ships reopened, there were suddenly experts that said something about the degree of cleaning. I mean, cleaning became a thing. So I had actually seen this phenomenon in the wake of mad cow crisis back in 1996, when suddenly all kinds of experts appeared about how do you certify, what meat is the right meat to eat, and overnight, suddenly Sainsbury's knew better than the British public health authorities knew. And how do we know that? Because the ministry in question was actually dissolved because of the crisis. So the ministry obviously was unable to maintain its sovereignty in a sense. Whereas it turned out that supermarkets were telling you, we certified that this meat came from Argentina, and this was before cows had passports. I mean, that, was a sort of, well, cows did end up getting passports, but this was a sort of policy lag type of case. Okay, so, what is the nature of the rulership? What are the sources of power? How does legitimation occur? That became the study that I've begun to think is much more important for us, and I hope that there are others in this audience who will agree that this is an important thing to talk about. So on the left-hand side of this bifurcation, which shouldn't be presented only as a bifurcation, are these questions that we've grappled with for a very long time. And anybody in a law school is familiar with these. Anybody in a political science department is familiar with these. Anybody who thinks they're a citizen and go to exercise their right to vote is in some sense, tacit sense at least, familiar with these. But what about epistemic delegation? What about the fact that many of us who do critical social theory understand that knowledge is power and power is knowledge to some extent? But, you know, how is that knowledge and power being exercised? Who's authorized, especially in a world that is lacking in borders? Before we started talking, we were joking, Warwick and Jean and I, about how globalization is so passé, and now we say planetary. But who is doing planetary governance, and how do we understand it? Questions of subsidiarity. We know what it means in legal terms. Do we know what it means or should mean in epistemic terms? When is it okay? When is it okay for a parent to say, mom knows best and better than the teacher? I mean, it's not like the question doesn't come up, right? But when is it okay to say, I understand what impact this will have on my child if I keep the child home from school, and you, O public health authority, you A, don't understand, and B, never have done the research anyway. I mean, so, you know, these subsidiarity questions are out there lurking, but we don't, they're implicit. We haven't really talked about them. So countries turned out to be places where epistemic and political authority were very well synchronized. When one gives lectures, one likes to do visuals, but this, I thought, was a lovely visual from Kuwait that showed, you know, a synchronicity between public health sovereignty and political sovereignty, people sitting neatly in their chairs and in their rows. And in America, on the other hand, when people tried to do the same thing, people started labeling the governor of Michigan, one of our larger states, a Nazi, and hatched a plot to kidnap her, and some people have actually been tried and convicted of this plot. I can't resist doing an aside that has nothing to do with the talk per se, though I'd be happy to talk more about it, that Gretchen Whitmer, to reestablish her credibility, though she did very well in the last election, has jumped on another new bandwagon. And she was wearing pink already, but her staff is now portraying her as the Barbie governor. So in America, you evidently restore your respectability not through the science, but through the color pink. Anyway, so maybe that should reassure all of the female-tending people in this audience. Anyway, but there is a more serious way to approach this, and that is to ask, well, when do people accept restraints and when do they not? And there are lots of examples of restraints that are widely accepted. So, you know, we don't have movements around blood tests for infants. I mean, people routinely go through this and hardly anyone opts out. Childhood vaccination, similarly, until recently, there's been very little pushback against that, not for 100 years. Smoking bans, I mean, even the French adopted smoking bans in the metro astonishingly fast. So what is it about compulsory vaccination? So I think one needs to take a step back, and what I want to talk about briefly is that in America, it wasn't about vaccine hesitancy only. It was about all manner of restraints. And America really stands out, now I'm talking about the US and not all of North America, as a place where pretty much every public health mandate that was put out met with immense amounts of dissatisfaction and pushback, and masking was one of them. And this little quote out of the Washington Post early in the pandemic, June 2020, I think puts the dichotomy pretty well. To many people, masks represent adherence to civic duty and willingness to make individual sacrifices for the greater good. To others, masks symbolize government overreach and a violation of personal liberty. I thought this was an astonishing visual, What it depicts is the chance that all 5 people are wearing masks in 5 random encounters at a particular time in the pandemic. But those of you who are familiar with electoral maps of the US will see that the pinks, maybe this is a forerunner of Barbie, but the pinks in the picture coincide with blues for political regions. I mean, so the 100% areas are all in the bluest of blue states, whereas the 0% areas are in the reddest of red states. So the civic duty seems to go hand in hand with political adherence and affiliation, and I think that one needs to theorize that in political terms somehow and try to understand it more deeply. So one thing one gets is the embeddedness of these things. I mean, so it's not just that the government says wear masks, surely not just the federal government, but there's a whole apparatus, what Foucault would have called an apparatus, that is standing ready and is able to enact it. So I live in a school of public policy, which of course churns out people who are going to work for government, so they have to believe that government actually has power. And the Kennedy School, to this day, had more extreme policies than other parts of Harvard. So there was a day when I went to our cafeteria when they were making us sit at one person to a table, and then I went to an undergraduate event at 6 o'clock on the same day where there were 100 people sitting in a room with no masks and so forth at Harvard, the same university, and diametrically different kinds of regulations. There was a point at which I asked one of our administrative officials, why is it that MIT, it's the Institute of Technology, famous throughout the world, says that you can have a 1 mask down rule, which means that lecturers can lecture without a mask, but at Harvard, everybody has to wear a mask. And the reply I got was, well, I guess MIT is less risk averse than Harvard. Now, I mean, true, false, it was a very interesting social theory. But this picture shows how willingly we took masking on board into the routines of our school. So the Kennedy School's motto, quoting from JFK, is ask what you can do. I don't know how many thousands of dollars we paid to create this. This was before Ukraine, so the colors stood for the Kennedy School at the time, but really mask what you can do? I mean, anyway, so I liked the breakdown towards the end when the bureaucratic regime was breaking down. But the point of these pictures is to show that you don't actually get public health sovereignty without a bureaucratic substructure that is willing to go along with it and play the part of enforcing and implementing the science. So what was the matter? And, as I think many of you in this room know, this man came to symbolize a lot of the anxieties in America. And Fauci was accused of flip-flopping, which to some extent, I suppose he did. But this is a piece of dialogue that actually illustrates something that took hold in the American public imagination, and they just couldn't get over it. That at some point, Fauci had said, you don't need to mask. And then once it became clear that people can spread the virus without knowing they're sick, then the message needed to change. And, immediately people started asking the White House, did they dig this up because they were doing opposition research on Fauci? And, so the interweaving of politics and expertise is very clear there. So if you walk around Cambridge, Massachusetts, you see on many yards, or you did used to see until maybe a couple of months ago, signs saying various things. And in Fauci we trust was one of the signs that regularly appeared on people's lawns. But this is from the other side of Fauci we do not trust, and all of the different places where the flip-flopping had occurred in high places. So when we got freed from COVID, we did that stylistically in different ways. In the Kennedy School, even the freedom was bureaucratized. So, you will not know, but maybe some of you do, that March 13th was the day, 2020, that the lockdown went into effect. So exactly 2 years later, they decided that now it was time to give up, and it was March 14th that, I had already predicted that, and people said, how did you know that it would be March 14th? I said, because they wouldn't want to go more than 2 years. But it was all hedged around, so only except for people completing isolation. I mean, so there's rules within rules within rules. And I'll show you the difference in other places. And this is now, of course, bled over into other areas other than masking. This is the most famous area, but I wanted to show you again how issues get tied up together. So vaccines are made with aborted fetal tissues, is side by side with bodily autonomy and causing injury and death. I mean, so 3 different explanations are running together. And one of the most recent sort of political flaps of a minor sort that happened was when this poor flailing Governor Ron DeSantis was asked whether he would accept Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the country's most noted anti-vaxxer, as a running mate, and he said no, but he would be happy to sick him onto the FDA if he'd be willing to serve. So what's at stake in these kinds of debates and pushbacks? And I think one can take a smidgen of STS theory and realize that, the sort of deep embeddings of belief systems can be thought about as networks in a sense, and that different nodes of this network have frailties associated with them. So in America, there's always a frailty in the federal system. Does the federal system have the authority? And the idea that FDA needs oversight from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is pointing directly to that part of the frailty. What about the fact that, people think that say no to Bill Gates? I mean, how do you go from trust in God to say no to Bill Gates? I mean, that's, it's worth thinking about. And, it's pushing back against capitalism, but in a very American sort of way. I mean, so nobody says Elon Musk shouldn't have money, but Bill Gates shouldn't have money. I mean, it gives one to think, as Hercule Poirot used to say back in the olden days. And then nature. Is nature best understood as mediated through science or through trust in God and, experiential knowledge or mediated technical knowledge? Is faith better than science? So this center is dedicated to comparative stuff, and all I can do is gesture, but the debate took different forms in different places. So this is a lovely picture of Macron, and I won't say anything more about it because I think everybody's familiar with the particular ways in which Macron has appeared as Mr. Superman in the French political system. But the pushback in France has been through an assertion of citizenship. And this particular image in which a French woman dons the Statue of Liberty costume but says, we pay our taxes, we respect the law, we are citizens. Therefore, the state does not have a right to make this imposition. It is a theory of sovereignty that's appearing there in very articulate and explicit terms. What makes one a citizen and therefore able to determine for oneself that a certain kind of consent is necessary in order to abide by the public health regime. It's interesting that the Germans have taken on, not the Germans, but the AfD, the fringe, relatively fringe right-wing party in Germany, has also picked up on the Gates idea and invited Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be one of the people. So, I mean, there's a kind of globalization of skepticism that is taking hold in parts of the German political system. And then, in contrast to the way in which the Kennedy School celebrated Freedom Day, this is how Britain celebrated Freedom Day. These images, as far as I can tell, the left-hand one is July 12th, King's Cross Station, and the right-hand one is July 19th, so it's a week later. But in view of what made Boris Johnson lose his prime ministership, it's worth thinking what Britain felt needed to be celebrated on the day of freedom and what it is that was the analog, and in Britain it was very much, we're fighting World War II again, and so the Day of Freedom is VE Day all over again, or something like that. All right, so how do we make sense of all of this? And I'll try to move very quickly through this so that we have a little time for discussion. I mean, I think what we're seeing is something that I've called civic epistemologies. I mean, that is stylized ways in which societies want to know things, are used to knowing things, and take things on board. But civic epistemologies have been defined mostly in relation to nation-specific styles. And of course, some of what I'm talking about, both the travel of the Wuhan virus and the travel of phenomena like vaccine hesitancy, are arguably not self-contained and tied to national boundaries. So how do we get around those kinds of problems? And I think that one way around it is to understand more deeply what is at stake in these civic epistemologies. And I suggest that what we need to look at is the sort of constitutional underpinnings of why people want their evidence in those ways. And that then becomes a reason for doing comparative work, and also a reason for thinking that nation states, after all, still do matter to our ways of making sense of the world and understanding how a global politics or a planetary politics of public health protection, what things it might need to be attentive to and what things it might need to look at. So again, this is an earlier work of mine that you can look at political cultures and you can think about how different parts of Australia might pattern in relation to this, but based on really many different kinds of cases and many different, and across longish periods of time, my sense is that the ways in which expertise comes into a political system, I've called this the three-body problem, because it's the bodies of individual experts, but also bodies of knowledge, and also collective bodies, advisory committees and other collectives, that this varies across countries, that Britain to this day pays more attention to the legitimacy of the particular individuals. Are they law-abiding? And if you cast your mind back across the big scandals of the British COVID era, it's about individuals misbehaving. Did they drive too far without an excuse? Did they see their partners when everybody else was under lockdown? And notoriously, and above all, did they party when the whole rest of the country was not allowed to party? So the rest of the country was obeying wartime rules, whereas Boris Johnson was living it up every day as if the war had been won. I mean, this was just not thinkable. So this is the sort of embodied expertise regime in which the individual's rectitude matters a great deal, whereas in America, it's the knowledge first and foremost. Is it objective? Is it slanted? Did the expert flip-flop because they didn't know or misrepresented or lied about what the true knowledge was? And in Germany, it is the collective. It's the Habermasian perfect collective that knows the things together. And as I say, I'd be happy to say more about this, but these are sort of stylized central tendencies in these different countries that have held up over time. So what I think we need to do is understand that these central tendencies themselves are part of constitutional culture. Why is it that this is where people are putting their faith, and this is how people are addressing that question of the tacit delegations to experts? What is this sort of underlying constitutional structure, and how do we begin to uncover it as researchers, as we should? So, okay, trust the science, but science, as I've said already, does not speak to us. It speaks through experts, and hence it's already embodied. And science enters the political domain as expertise. Experts then turn around and say, we are governing in accordance with the science. But it is an over and over demonstrated STS finding that the science that experts declare is the end point of the process of their deliberation. So it's an IPCC working over decades that says things about climate change, not that climate change lands like a Pentecostal flame on people's heads and says, behold, I am climate change. So, this question of how experts rely on science and how science underwrites expertise is part of what I'm calling the tacit constitutional compact that we live with. And one can talk about it at different scales of governance. One can talk about it in an institution like the Kennedy School. One can talk about it at a national level, at a regional level. And one can talk about whether there are emerging global structures here as well. So why engage in this kind of analysis? And this is where I'll stop. Well, there's obviously an instrumental purpose if we want good government. If we want to avoid a kind of dictatorship of expertise, we should be asking, where does the legitimacy come from, and what underlies it, and on what theories of delegation have we let experts, run away with aspects of our lives? And for people who think about whether uptake matters as well, it's been demonstrated again in many case studies that policies that allow a kind of dictatorial exercise of expertise often end up not meeting people's expectations, and there's rebellion down the line. So one needs modes of persuasion that one might call public reason that actually pay attention to this, the gap between what the public is willing to accept as an argument and what experts are willing to offer as an argument. So I'm sure we'll come back to that point. But there's also a more reflexive and critical kind of payoff, and that is, I think, self-knowledge about societies. I mean, we should all have a stake after having gone through these traumatic times in how we've organized ourselves as societies to respond, and where we've asked questions and where we haven't asked questions. And between then the chandelier of expertise and the shantytown of experience, where are the explanations? Where should we be looking? And maybe sometimes, there's this Yeats poem where he says, I must lie down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. And I think that that's a kind of metaphor for the need to go back and touch ground. Touch ground for democracy. How do people think about it? And where are their ideas coming from? I think that's what Charles Perkins, if I read his life right at all, was doing when, on the one hand, he was getting degrees from the university, but on the other hand, was also doing the Freedom Ride. Speaking in different ways to different aspects of his own life. And then last but not least, there's the intellectual and theoretical dimension. And I know that a lot of you care about interdisciplinarity. I've come to think that interdisciplinarity is more interesting because of the spaces that do not belong to any discipline, rather than because a discipline can talk to another and sometimes get more bang for the buck. And so to the extent that the kinds of forward-looking research that I'm suggesting allows us to colonize some of these non-spaces where nobody is at the moment, like what is the political theory of expertise that is operative in a particular context, and how should we be thinking about that? That allows us, I think, to do the full circle, return to questions about democracy, return to questions about public reason, and have a 21st century political theory that perhaps Plato would not quite have recognized as his own. I do want to give one credit, which was on my first slide, but my friend and colleague Alex Wellerstein, who is a historian of technology at the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey, does a lot of our visuals for us. And he produced this brilliant mashup between COVID and the great Hobbes Leviathan illustration to talk about public health sovereignty. And so on that note, let me thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. That was wonderful. Thank you. In the face of massive uncertainty, because this was unrolling as an experiment that we'd never conducted on ourselves before, So I just wondered, Sheila, how does interdisciplinarity in expertise get managed when it comes to the political discourse?
Well, I mean, of course, that's a huge question, and one has to ask, what is it that one wants, from the people who are going to set the parameters of how we're going to live, and who is best suited to be talking about it. So if you look at the American case, and you look at maybe the first 6 months or so of it, there was Mr. Trump, there was the subsequently disgraced Mr. Cuomo, and of course there was Mr. Fauci. There were others as well, but those were 3 very prominent figures, and of those, only Fauci met the requisites of being an expert at all. If you ask what made him a spokesperson at all, you would have to say that he had bridged in a way that set of interdisciplinarities because of managing another public health crisis. So there was a historical grounding, and recently there was a memorial service for Kramer, the public health AIDS activist, and Fauci spoke at it, and he spoke about the fact that they were deep frenemies, and how that had come about. But it was utterly important to his ability to muster any kind of authority during the crisis, not what he knew technically about the virus, but what he knew about precisely managing that kind of situation of uncertainty. But similarly, Andrew Cuomo got extraordinarily high marks. Why? I mean, again, he did produce a lot of charts and graphs and simplify things and talk to people, but what people took home, and he actually got an award for this before he was laid low for harassment reasons, was the ability to sort of relate it to familial circumstances, and talking about his mother and how old she was and how difficult it was not to be able to visit her, and yet, explaining to people partly that he was in the same boat, that there were reasons to interpret the uncertainty in a particular way without feeling that that was an imposition, that this was the way a reasonable person would. So in a way, these translation agents were, if they were experts at anything, the successful ones, it was not because of technical knowledge so much, but because of the ability to project judgment.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I find most troublesome about today's world is that this commodity called judgment is under such suspicion that we're in danger of producing non-judging societies. I mean, people are extremely reluctant to trust anybody to exercise judgment on their behalf. But if you think, well, there's a kind of virtue that was underpinning the judgment, it means that we're giving up on the idea of social virtue altogether. And I think that that's a very dangerous place and a dangerous way to go. So that may not be a satisfying response, but I think it's borne out by our experience of this crisis, that even if you manage to create the ideal AI-generated model for who is the right set of experts to be opining on this, your AI would only be correct for maybe a moment, because the world would turn and there would be a different kaleidoscope and different expertises would come into play. Whereas the need for a constant presence of at least somewhat reliable judgment, that I think is a constant. I mean, that I think does not go away, regardless of how that world of knowledge, world of expertise turns below the surface.
Of course, Fauci had learned a lot about civic epistemologies and politics through his experience with AIDS earlier. and he was well prepared to make those alliances and connections when COVID-19 came around. I mean, I got an email from Fauci when I wrote a sociological article about herd immunity, and I thought, why is he reading this? And he was saying how he was interested in the social sciences in relation to AIDS, not just the virology. And I think having somebody who was had that sort of breadth of expertise beyond virology, epidemiology, but including social science expertise, really, that he'd developed through experience of dealing with other pandemics.
It's surprising, Warwick, how little mention there was about the AIDS experience in talking about COVID, and how little public discussion there was about, people took Fauci's trustworthiness or not as black and white markers. If you're a blue state Democrat, of course you trust Fauci. Why? Because he's speaking for the science. Not that he's speaking for a life experience in which he had dealt with another crisis, which was rapidly evolving, the knowledge was changing, the remedies were not present, and one of the things that he had to grapple with was, how do you manage a public health enterprise that is supposed to be doing research and set priorities, when the patients are clamoring at your door and staging die-ins and, all of that. So, but there was no public discussion of what the right grounds for trusting Fauci might be. It was like, either you believe he's a truth-telling, prophet, or you draw out his nose and he's Pinocchio.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about Mr. Fauci, I think compared with many other experts in different countries, actually when the pandemic took place, Mr. Fauci already in a very good position because he has advised years for previous United States presidents, right? And so actually I'm wondering, for people, my colleagues here and the university help us to become experts. Our role as an experts in peaceful time or crisis is to speak to people under the chandelier, right, to the powerful person. And also we need to inform people in the shanty town, especially the indigenous peoples, people may not have a good education or resources, etc. However, according to your presentation, I see that actually experts, speaking of science, there are a lot of barriers, especially the way of translation or way of communication. Compared with Mr. Fauci, who already in the administration for years. So do you have any advice like for people they hope to contribute, for the future of the next time the crisis, maybe climate change. Today we talk about maybe in the summertime, Australia will be very hot. Consider the hot waves in France or Europe. So do you have any advice, in this regard?
Yeah, well, it's not my advice, right? I mean, so people have been. There's a whole branch of scholarship called science communication, right? And communicating risk and doing this under crisis conditions. I think a few generalizations have come out of that are worth keeping in mind. To a science studies person like me, one of the major ones is that scientific advice often has really unexamined pockets of assumption about both the science and the society, and it's never questioned. So, being, after all, a sort of STS scholar not able to leave home to do much for many months at a time, I was observing various things. Ridiculous things like, at what age should a child be required to wear a mask, and what reasons were given? In the city of Boston, it was, I think, 3 years old, and in the town of Cambridge, it was 2 years old. Now, why? These are contiguous places, both as blue could be, and both with a high concentration of experts. But of course, they were not talking to one another. Somebody went into a room and came out saying, oh, yeah, too, because they, any younger and they'll just rip it off or whatever. And somebody else maybe got together and said, well, 3, because there's no epidemiological evidence that is about very young children or something. But we have no way of knowing. We have no way of knowing, and therefore it's opaque, and therefore if somebody inimical to the public health enterprise found those kinds of contradictions, if they had the patience of a science studies scholar who looks at controversies and does look for contradictions, there would be even less faith, because you would find that there are infinite numbers of places where people make leaps of judgment without bothering to explain why they're doing this. And they can say, okay, it's tacit knowledge. I have it at my fingertips. This makes sense. That other thing doesn't make sense. But if they were made to articulate it, I think that it would look different. And maybe some occasional admissions that, okay, we have reached an arbitrary decision here. I mean, another example I can give you is that I sit on an ethics committee that was established because of embryonic stem cell research, but the teaching hospitals in Boston have a different ethics committee, and everybody's worried about implanting human neuronal cells into animals, because frankly nobody knows what the effects are or what degree of intrusion would create. I mean, everybody's morally certain that you don't want to produce mice that really behave like people, okay? I mean, so that is taken as a sine qua non of moral truth somehow, even though there's fiction about it, of course, that says it's okay. But our group, our ethics body, decided that it was important to ask the researchers how many cells they were going to implant. And then we had a meeting one day with the hospital ethics group, and they said, you know, why are you asking for numbers? There are no studies that say anything about what numbers of cells need to be implanted in order to create an effect of the sort that you don't want. There's just no science there, so why are you looking at the numbers? Whereas our group thought that it was reasonable, in the dead absence of any knowledge, to take the number of implanted cells as a rough marker of the degree of intrusiveness. And yet, you know, here were 2 expert bodies that were disagreeing on a point with ethical ramifications that are quite deep. You know, when are you crossing the species line? So I think that experts need to become somewhat more humble and aware of those kinds of judgmental leaps in places where they could be questioned themselves. And the other thing that has come out as a pretty constant salient discovery is that one reason people don't listen to experts is that experts are not really addressing their question. So experts tend to end up framing what they want to talk about in relation to what they think people should be wanting to talk about. The classic case is many more people have died or been injured in coal mining, Australia's a mining country, you know this, than out of nuclear power accidents, and yet the movement against nuclear power is far, far, far stronger than the movement against coal. And nuclear experts from the day of Oppenheimer, now that we're regurgitating that history, have called attention to this and said the public is irrational, the public is non-expert, the public doesn't know, and many more people die in car accidents than nuclear power accidents, and certainly coal mining. And therefore, if you want to stop an energy trajectory, you would stop coal and not nuclear power. It turns out that's not what people care about. What they care about is that day of Trinity, and they know that if this thing happened, it would be utterly devastating, and they don't, and people feel differently about whether 150,000 people get killed in one go, or if it happens slowly over time and it's 10,000 a year. I mean, people just happen to care about that. So, you know, not, you know, telling people you don't get the statistics, you don't understand higher mathematics, you don't get probabilities. Experts say this all the time. I've heard them say this repeatedly. It's just missing the point. It's missing the point that the meaning of a disaster is not in the mathematical probability, but in the nature of the disruption of social life that it will mean to people that they can feel on their skin and understand.
Can I press you on that a bit further, Sheila? Because we have here at the Charles Perkins Centre a solutions domain, and I think we're all committed to trying to translate the science into some sort of practical outcome policy as well as clinical interventions and so on. But quite often we sort of reach an impasse in a way, probably for the reasons that you've just mentioned. So what does a scientist do in that? I mean, what is a scientist to do? How does a scientist, in a sense, become more like Fauci? Are you saying that scientists need to become anthropologists in a way and understand civic epistemologies? And if so, how would they do that?
Well, Warwick, don't you think it has to be a two-way street? I mean, so it's not just the scientists making themselves, or the scientists making themselves into cultural anthropologists and understanding somebody else's reason, but it's also the other way around, that the receiving culture has to understand and accept the scientist's reason for why. And we have mediating institutions. I mean, this is where law comes in, and this is where I am eternally grateful that that is my disciplinary heritage that I can go back to. So 1905, the landmark decision in the US Supreme Court about why people need to get vaccinated. So there are many things one could say, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, about that case. It's very interesting. The guy was a Swedish emigre and, had different ideas about, and he had his own theory about how he had nearly died as a child, and so he didn't want to get vaccinated again, and so on and so forth. But the point is that it was turned into a constitutional question, and people trusted the legal system to come up with an answer about not who is right on the substance of the health question, but given that there is a split, how should the authority to cut into that dispute be resolved? And people decided that it was okay to trust the court system to come up with the answer to that, which today would be much harder in the American constitutional legal system as it stands today. But I think it cycles back to what I was saying to Stephen. I mean, it's a question of, ultimately a lot of these issues become questions of political theory and constitutionalism because it's about where a culture chooses to repose its ultimate resting places for trust. That, I think, is very variable. You take families, they may be alike in many respects, but Jewish families have typically imposed or posed greater trust in the wisdom of the mother than the wisdom of the father. I mean, maybe that's what the matrilineal society goes back to in some sense. But in which matters do you trust whom? I mean, these are very profoundly embedded, historically reaffirmed questions for societies. And I think just telling scientists you have to become better anthropologists doesn't go the whole way. It requires that reciprocity for people to understand why the scientist is even looking at the question in these particular ways and not in those ways. I think if you take the entire vaccine autism debate, which many people pin the current COVID vaccine anxiety back to, that has been studied by anthropologists, and it's certainly been shown that the anxiety of the parents has a very different starting point from the certainties of the people who say that herd immunity is a good thing and you should get vaccinated, and besides, the Lancet article was completely flawed and was the work of a rogue scientist and should have been withdrawn, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's talking at cross purposes, really.
Yes, Also following with Warwick's question, I'm wondering that today we talk about COVID-19. Many countries, Australia, we already declared that this is the end of pandemic. But we're looking forward. There may be another COVID-19 pandemic, but what we are looking at, like a global warming or other crises. So do you think what you discussed today may have broader implications to other fields?
I think that, of course, it has implications. I was looking at energy transitions before the COVID crisis came about, and many of the kinds of problems that were the political problems that people were identifying, NIMBY syndrome, so that people don't want windmills in their line of sight, for instance. I mean, people haven't called that windmill hesitancy or whatever, or wind denialism, but it could be called things like that. So I think that there's a lot of relevance from any of these experiences to go across sectors and cut across sectors. But one thing I would say is that the lessons you draw are ultimately also STS questions. I mean, why does a person look at a situation and say that this is what I conclude from this? I mean, do I conclude that the public is hopelessly illiterate, or do I conclude that the experts didn't earn the trust of the public in accordance with that public's civic epistemologies? I mean, I think the British case, because it has these unexpected touches of humor, which is, after all, one of the things that the UK has bestowed on the rest of the world, is, to me, a little bit less fraught to look at than the American case, which just makes you want to weep. So, I'd rather laugh than weep. So, I think we all owe Boris Johnson,
Boris Johnson,
some
buffoonery has a certain
because of making
quality.
certain things clear, because of showing the limits of a kind of transgressive personality that is attempting to impose order on the rest of society, but is maintaining this kind of distance between self and other. I mean, so, this is a very interesting sort of political culture comparison. Why is it that Britain ultimately turned against Johnson, whereas at the moment, Trump is commanding a boost in the polls, like every new indictment gets him more percentage points, not fewer percentage points. I mean, so that, I think, goes back to these sort of constitutional questions of the way that trust is organized and enacted in societies that I think lies in this sort of blank spaces of interdisciplinarity.
But a contrast, of course, in relation to trust is the military. And certainly in Australia and the US, right across Europe generally, there was a militarisation quite often of the response to the pandemic. And people seem to have infinite trust almost in the military to solve these problems in a way they don't. Well, they certainly don't trust politicians, perhaps wisely, but they don't trust scientists even in the same way they seem to trust a general to roll out a vaccine.
So I think that that's a really fascinating question, and one that I hope more work will be done on. But there was a point, again, in my personal ruminations about what was going on, when I thought it'd be really interesting to ask our 16 countries to what extent is the war and military metaphor being used, and how is it being mobilized? And it turned out to be very, very different. So the Chinese were all out military. They were pulling out all of the moves that you do in a militarization context. Britain was reliving World War II. I mean, so it was making the sacrifices, and then, and I just alluded to it here with the Freedom Day, but there was very much that sense that we won World War II because we agreed to form this compact of shared sacrifice. Angela Merkel alluded to World War II only once, very publicly, but it was at a time when Germany was really chafing at the bit, and I think it was when she imposed a major holiday ban on travel, like around Christmas of maybe the second year, and then she reminded people about the huge sacrifices that had, but no triumphalism. Whereas in Britain it was triumphalism, and we were the first to roll out the vaccine, and hence the triumphalism. And Sweden, our Swedish colleagues said that war never made an appearance in their public discourse at all. So I think that the comparative stuff again shows the different ways in which public health sovereignty has been interwoven with the degree of militarization and how the military model becomes a surrogate model for state efficacy, and that the 16 countries turn out to operate differently. This country, which celebrates World War I as its coming of age and becoming a nation, you know, obviously,
Spirit of Anzac.
you know, is going to be an interesting case from that point of
And
view.
a defeat at that. So it was,
But a heroic.
a heroic defeat. Well, look, I think we've run to the end of our time. I'd like us to perhaps think and reflect. You've outlined an extraordinary research agenda. I think the comparative approach, the taking advantage of what's happened over the last 3 years to really explore what it means to be an expert, how expertise relates to civil society and through the institutions of the law and politics, and what is the nature of trust and the capacity for people to manage the messages that involve uncertainty. Those seem to be such huge questions, and really look forward to how the parsing of this will come out over years to come. So, Sheila, I think on that, and thank you to Jean and Warwick as well, we should thank Professor Jasanoff for an extraordinary lecture. Thank you.